Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is William Keat of lawandalchemy.org and commonlawconstitution.org. Welcome back. So this is the series on individualism and collectivism, carrying on, and this is now part 7. So we're getting through it. So in the last part, we were talking about self-determination of the individual, and the fact that the freedom of the individual to make choices for himself is directly connected with the health of the individual, psychological health, physical health, maybe emotional health. All of that is connected to the ability of the individual to be self-determining and make their own choices in life. And that also affects the community as well. So we're going to take that to the next step, because if you take that sort of individual living, making choices for yourself to the furthest extent, what you're really talking about is self-mastery. Is the individual being a self-master? Are they embodying responsibility and trustworthiness to that fullest extent? And that's the question, isn't it? So what does self-mastery really mean? So that's what we're going to look at now, because that's ultimately what we're saying that individualists are, ultimately. So an individualist society in the collective at large places people as their own master. In other words, it's basically saying to all individuals within society, you are your own government, or your own king, in your kingdom of one, you could say. And that's a very efficient society because it's not having to be run from the center. It's basically trusting individuals to manage themselves properly and responsibly. That's a society that's going to run very well. So individuals learn to become responsible and trustworthy, not only to themselves, that's important, we're going to explore that, but to others around them as well. And so this is kind of, it's kind of oiling the wheels of society in a sense. It's more than that, really. I mean, that's a bit of an understatement, to oil the wheels of society. Well, to make sure that everybody takes responsibility for themselves is that on steroids, really, isn't it? So this is really, in a way, about integrity. It's in order to achieve, for an individual to achieve that self-mastery, what it really requires is a consistent application of principles. That in turn means no internal contradictions, because you're not in control of yourself unless everything that you believe, everything that you think, everything that you feel, and what you say and do is in sync, is in alignment. Because if it isn't, then there are internal contradictions there. You're in conflict internally, and that means you're out of control, right? So you only have a level of control if everything is coherent. There's a coherence within you, and it all hangs together. And that's essentially what integrity means. If you are authentic and you are somebody of integrity, it means that you've ironed out all of those internal conflicts and contradictions. And that means that you've got to apply your principles consistently. So this means you have to use rationality. You have to use logic in order to get your morals and ethics and principles consistent. Yeah, a lack of consistency in the application of your moral standards means you lack foundational principles. Okay, and it means, so for an example of that is the very subject that we're talking about now. Okay, so believing in individual rights and claiming that you're an individualist, whilst at the same time, say, believing that people should be provided free housing through taxation. That would be a contradiction. Okay, and again, I'm sounding unfeeling there, but actually I'm just extrapolating the logic behind this. And we're going to get into that just a little bit more as well as we go through. But what we're often saying here is that people are becoming morally relativist. It means that they're kind of making it up as they go along. You're going through life choosing to apply a principle in one situation when it suits you, but not in others. Yeah, and those exceptions are not based on any kind of moral principle. So an example of that, let's just think about an example. And there was an interesting one that came up the other day, where someone was explaining to me, of course, that the tax breaks are being removed shortly on private education, on independent schools. Okay, so at the moment, private education, fee-paying schools enjoy a tax break. Okay, you don't pay tax on that education. Now, this is a tricky topic for some people, and it gets people going because they feel, understandably, that there is a lack of fairness, that everybody should be receiving a good education. Okay, and this is presupposing that in independent fee-paying schools that are simply following the same national curriculum and all the rest of it is a good education. I'm not necessarily saying that that is the case. But in many ways it is, because one of the best things that, of course, it buys, and I know this because I was a teacher in that system, is that it buys smaller class sizes. And so therefore, as a pupil, you will get much more attention. Yes, you could say that also the money often goes into sort of fantastic facilities and things like that. And that might be the case. It's not always the case, actually. But anyway, people see that kind of lack of fairness in something that's very fundamental, a child's education. And I get that. And, you know, everybody, people feel that there should be a fairness in that. But again, we're going back to this business of trying to equalize things. Yeah, that is a caring sentiment. I get it. Okay, but one could delve into this a little more deeply, that taxation, you could say, is immoral anyway. We shouldn't be taxing anything. And it just shouldn't be there. Yeah. Now, you could say, some people might argue, for example, quite rightly, you could say, well, having a tax break on education, but not a tax break on something else, is destroying equity or denying equity. And they would be right in a sense, except that I would then argue that actually by having tax at all will automatically bring about an inequitable situation, because you can't tax everything. And for the reasons we've already talked about in the past sections that we've dealt with, you're always going to have an inequitable situation if you try to right what you perceive as wrongs. Yeah, so it just shouldn't be there in the first place. Yeah. The people who support private education will argue that there's something special about education, that actually it shouldn't be taxed. And you could say that there's a pretty bad optics on the part of a Labour government to decide to tax something as fundamentally important as private education, when the people who are taking advantage of that private education are also continuing to pay their other taxes to fund a place in the maintained sector that they are not using. Yeah, so this is where it gets really complicated, and it becomes a bloody mess. Okay, so you can argue this in all sorts of different ways, but ultimately, when it comes down to it, you really shouldn't be having tax at all, because it's not somebody else's decision to decide that something should be taxed and something should not be taxed. And taxation is itself the most fundamental problem, because ultimately it's forcing something out of you. And we all have a right to decide how to spend our money, or time, effort, creativity, which is what your money is the result of, on whatever we want. Yeah, so that's a bloody mess. But it's a very good example of understanding that really taxation is a massive problem in the first place. It shouldn't even be there. And it shows the contradictions. Okay, so I'm not saying this to get political. What I'm doing is saying this to demonstrate the fact that there are contradictions in people's thinking. Yeah, these things shouldn't exist in the first place. And they exist because people are contradicted in their thinking. Yeah, so another example would be a really good meme I saw the other day of two college kids talking to each other, and one says to the other, "I believe in free speech, except hate speech." And the other one says, "I believe in physics, except gravity." It's just a really good example of the kind of like, doublethink that's going on in people's minds. You can't think like this. You have to get through it down to the base principle and see that you are applying principles consistently. Otherwise, you're going to be in conflict internally all the time, and that's going to cause chaos in your life. And often these things, come down to a degree of application or exception. Yeah, if you think about that example I've just given, I believe in free speech, except hate speech. Yeah, okay, well, where does it go into hate speech? Well, someone's got to decide that, and that's always going to be the opinion of somebody. Yeah, and it's a little bit like degree. I believe in this much, okay, but at this point, this is where it becomes wrong, whatever it is. Yeah, well, then it becomes a degree of something. Well, someone's got to decide what the amount of something is fair and okay, and then it goes into unfairness. Well, that's just down to opinion again. Yeah. So this is the problem. You have to, true fairness comes back to whatever is natural. Yeah, whatever's there in nature, because that's the only way that we can create that situation. Okay, moving on. So respect and self-respect, you have to earn it. So this is where the problem comes, that if you are contradicted internally, if you're starting to lie to yourself about things because you're not applying principles consistently, this is where you start to lose respect for yourself at a subconscious level, often at a subconscious level. Sometimes people know that they're lying to themselves, but well, you always do at some level. Sometimes it's much more at the surface and people actually know that they're kind of not being honest with themselves. But more often than not, it's much more subtle than that. And it's much more closely down at a subconscious level or completely unconscious. And they don't realize through their life that they've gone on long enough, just lying to themselves about something, being in the way that they apply those principles, and they haven't even spotted it or noticed it. So in the same way that you can't respect yourself unless you've earned it, you can't expect other people to respect you either. Okay, how do you earn that? By being honest internally. Ultimately, at some level, and however good your own self-deception might be, you know whether you've attempted to lie to yourself. You know whether your own internal narrative is true and honest. If it isn't, you have no respect for yourself, and that leads to disappointment in yourself, or even at the extreme level, self-hatred. All kinds of internal turmoil and contradiction comes about as a result. Sometimes the level of awareness of one's own contradictions is not there. It's all happening at a subconscious or unconscious level. And that is where it becomes most dangerous, because that's the point that you begin to deceive yourself. Okay, I would argue, actually, as I say in this in a minute in my notes, actually, that in fact that it's always possible to know that. And that's why there is that kind of self-hatred and turmoil within people. In this situation, you are far from being in control of yourself. You are anything but a self-master. You are demonstrating cowardice, apathy, or dishonesty within yourself. You cannot face truth when it becomes challenging. This means you have become a slave. Although one can self-deceive, one can never escape knowing at some level, despite attempting to tell yourself lies. Okay, so it's a bit depressing, isn't it? But there is this tendency for humans to do this because it's ultimately through fear. We don't want to face something that's uncomfortable. Okay, and what invariably happens is that we end up just telling ourselves tiny lies, micro lies, as I call them on my course. Which then leads to a further problem, because you've got to try and deceive yourself about the fact that you just told yourself a lie, and then you just start veering off track about your own internal narrative. Yeah, this is moral relativism. You're going through life choosing to apply a principle in one situation when it suits, but not in others. Yeah, so you lose respect for yourself, and you're not earning it. So yeah, this is really critical. It's getting into the psychology of it. So self-confidence grows when you witness your own integrity. Yeah, so when you start to become authentic and you do that internal work, and you start clearing out those conflicts and contradictions within yourself, then things start to get really good. Things come right in your life, because in fact, most of the crises and the disasters in a lot of people's lives, I think, actually come about through micro decisions that come about through erroneous thinking. Yes, self-destructive kind of patterns that start to develop through kind of negative feedback loops of, taking decisions from erroneous thinking that hasn't been thought through. You're not applying consistent principles in ways that you quite often can't even spot. Yeah. Someone who is honest with themselves, right to the foundations, is someone who doesn't compromise on their principles. They have begun to remove internal contradictions. This means that the beliefs they hold all fit together, and the choices they make as a result do not conflict with truth. They are supported by reality. If your life contains conflict and contradiction, that is evidence that aspects are not in sync with reality and truth. Yeah, so this is pretty deep stuff. This is the deepest we've got in all of this. But I'm trying to show and demonstrate that why it is that an individualist ideology is fundamentally in sync with nature and with natural law, whereas a collectivist ideology is in a way full of traps and errors and ultimately problems that will just take you down into an absolute void of nothingness. Ultimately, it's that bad, ladies and gentlemen. So further thoughts: a society that lies to itself in the collective also cannot respect itself. There is a collective self-loathing or a lack of self-respect as a community or nation. Yeah, so we tell ourselves lies at the collective level, as above, so below. It's one of the principles of Hermeticism. It's the principle of correspondence. The idea that in the macro level is things are reflected in the micro level and vice versa. Okay, so if you're examining yourself at the individual level, you're going to see the same things happening at the level in society generally, and we do exactly see that. And that's where society is going at the moment, because it's full of people who are lying to themselves, essentially. That's what is going on. Okay, so let's have an example of that, one or two examples. So the belief, for example, that, well, about governance is the biggest problem. Okay, that, well, one of those could be the idea that we can outsource our governance to the European Union, to Europe, yeah? We shouldn't even be centralizing our governance at all, really. We should be keeping governance as local as possible. But what people were lying to themselves about, essentially, was this idea that things would be better in our country if decisions and governance is done even more distantly away from us, when quite obviously it should be the opposite. That in order for transparency and accountability to work, you need to bring the decision-making process as close as possible to individuals as you possibly can. Yeah, not outsourcing it and making it even more distant. Yeah, so that was a big problem with the pro-EU and going into the European Union, all of that kind of stuff. Brexit was right. It wasn't right from the point of view of a referendum, because referenda is a problem, and that's majority voting. So that wasn't correct. But it wasn't right to be in Europe either, because you're outsourcing your governance, and that's a lie, essentially. And I heard an interesting discussion. I think it was in a shop or something, and I think it was Radio 5 Live, that great paragon of deep thought. But anyway, the presenter was talking about individual rights, and my ears pricked up, and I thought, oh, this will be interesting. And then she immediately started talking about democracy in the context of voting in elections. And I thought, oh no, you've absolutely contradicted yourself. You know, just not aware of it. Yeah. So there's an example of society believing that our governance is best done by voting in elections. And I deal with this, of course, on the other channel, Common Law Constitution. So do get on that if you want to get into that. But I'm talking about the fact that you're not being consistent in your principles, and are not spotting the contradictions. Yeah, but anyway, that's enough for now, because that was quite a long section, but it was getting quite deep there. But self-mastery and responsibility is about getting your thinking straightened out. Yeah, certainly at a logic level anyway. You know, life is much more about than just logic and reason. Yeah, it is about much more than that, actually. But at least if we get it straightened out at the logic and reason level, we can start to spot the traps that we're falling into. And hopefully that will have been useful. In the next section, actually, what we're going to do is just take stock a little bit and summarize a bit as to, because we'll be at the halfway point, probably a little more than halfway through, but it will be a chance to just reflect on this series and see where we've got to. But I hope you found that useful. Okay, cheers for now.